Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm sorry, unfortunately, that I'm going to have to disappoint you because I'm not going to be nearly as exciting as the character you now have in your imaginations, who apparently does all these amazing things with a tremendous degree of brilliance and aplomb. I will, however, be talking today, or I will be building today, to a pair of fairly big topics: democracy and even bigger Hollywood. Because as all of you know, Hollywood is bigger than everything. But what I'm going to start out by doing is engaging the question of the cognitive humanities. And as we've seen over this talk, the cognitive humanities can essentially be cashed out in two different ways, depending on whether we think of the humanities as driving the cognitive or the cognitive driving the humanities. So in version 1, where the humanities are boss, humanists draw on various theories about the brain, various brain studies to help them interpret literature, to help them interpret historical artifacts, to help them interpret deep philosophical conundra. Now, I should say that this approach is by no means universally beloved in the rest of the humanities, but because of the pioneering efforts of people like Lisa Sunshine and Suzanne Keen, it has become more accepted over time. The second method is not to incorporate the sciences into a humanities method, but to incorporate the humanities into a scientific method. And this approach is rather more controversial. Much of the published and popularly known work in this area is done by scientists, for example, David Kidd, Keith Oatley. There is, however, a small and intrepid band of literary scholars, some of whom we are honored enough to have at this conference, who have begun to launch their own scientific studies. So, for example, Gabrielle Starr, Natalie Phillips, Raphael Line at Cambridge, if you know him, Frederick Aldama, who was originally supposed to be giving this speech, but for some reason called me 10 days ago and said, "Angus, I have to go to Mexico," and then hung up, which is unfortunately why you're subjected to me right now, instead of the more brilliant and interesting version of myself. What makes this second approach to cognitive humanities so controversial is that it essentially seems to displace all of the traditional methods that humanists use, and it replaces them with scientific protocols. So in other words, it basically eliminates the basic thing that humanists do. Now, why wouldn't humanists like this? Why wouldn't they rush forward to embrace this brave new future in which we're all totally obsolescent, right? The future has arrived, and you are not in it. Sounds exciting. I want to sign up for this future. Well, the cynical argument is that we humanists want to hold on to our cultural capital. You know, the few of us who still have jobs would like to keep them. The more positive take on this is that through long years of doing what it is that we do, we have actually developed certain kinds of skills and expertise, which we think that even the most well-intentioned and enlightened science couldn't possibly replace, which is to say we recognize that the wholesale application of brain scanners and microscopes to the humanities would cost our society something very important. Now, like a lot of you, I imagine, I find myself kind of going back and forth between both sides of this debate. And in my own case, it's the product of my own somewhat eccentric education and upbringing. I started out in a neuroscience lab. I worked there for 4 years. I developed an enormous and powerful respect for the scientific method, for an experimental approach to life, for all the things that go along with neuroscience. But I left, permanently humiliating and embarrassing my advisor, to go get a PhD in literature, because I believed that there was something that literature could do, something powerful, something extraordinary, something that couldn't be reduced to what goes on in science labs. And so I appreciate both sides of the equation. On the one hand, I think there are enormously powerful and wonderful things that science can do in terms of helping us understand better what literature is, how it operates. But I also have this concern that we live in an age in which the public is so astounded by science, and science has such enormous prestige that there's this real danger that some of what is so special and distinct and unique about the humanities will essentially be wiped out by this enthusiasm, and our society will be ever impoverished, and future generations won't know these kinds of wonderful things that we've done. So is there a way to balance these two competing things? Is there a way to do scientific experiments that preserve this special and distinct thing that is the humanities? I think that there is, and I'm going to pitch today a distinct and fairly idiosyncratic, because it comes from a humanist, way of trying to balance these two concerns. And I want to argue that this is by no means the only way of doing any of these things. But I hope it's stimulating, interesting, distinct, and provocative enough to kind of keep the conversation moving forward. And what I'm going to do is offer an experimental approach in which the humanities preserves its own kind of distinctive role and function. And I'm going to begin by looking at the role that humanist methods, such as literary formalism and cultural historicism, can play in experiment design. That'll be the first part of the talk. In the second part of the talk, I'll move to considering how a kind of experimental approach to the humanities can actually grow the role of the humanities in modern democratic societies. And I'm going to end by arguing for a way in which the humanities can more aggressively promote themselves rhetorically, a way that does, in fact, involve making friends with people in Hollywood. So that's the kind of large and weird journey that you guys are going to be subjected to over the rest of this evening. So let me start with what humanists can do in terms of lab-based experiments. I've already talked about the way in which this is an area in which essentially scientists are leading the way, even though humanists have begun to do studies. The studies that are most published, most circulated, most recognized by places like the New York Times, by NPR, they are done by scientists. And these studies have done a very wonderful and powerful thing, which is they've demonstrated there is at least one social function for literature. And in particular, these studies have tended to focus on the role that literature can play in encouraging empathy. And these studies have also yielded a theory about a very interesting technical aspect of literature known as free indirect discourse, or FID. So what is FID? I'll start by giving you guys a famous early example of this. This is from the beginning of Jane Austen's first published novel, Sense and Sensibility. The free indirect discourse is in italics. Mrs. John Dashwood did not at all approve of what her husband intended to do for his sisters. To take 3,000 pounds from the fortune of their dear little boy would be impoverishing him to the most dreadful degree. She begged him to think again on the subject. So FID is very complex, but to get us started, we can observe that it involves a kind of pivot from this third-person perspective into a quasi-first-person perspective in which we're seeming to get a glimpse of the character's inner thoughts. So what's the cognitive function of this pivot? What is this doing to your brains when you read it? The most popular scientific hypothesis has been very elegantly articulated by Keith Oatley, and I'm going to quote here from his book, Such Stuff as Dreams. Consider how Jane Austen handles her character's thoughts when the prospect is announced of Bingley bringing a large party to the forthcoming dance. Nothing could be more delightful, she writes. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love. These two sentences are in free and direct style, newly invented in Jane Austen's time. This style is a cue to the reader to imagine himself or herself into the minds of the Bennet girls in their anticipation of the dance. Now, this scientific hypothesis has an enormous amount of explanatory power, and it's also been supported by a lot of interesting data that has been published that is coming out of science labs. If you're interested in some of that data, people like Marissa Bortolucci, Peter Dixon. But the example suggested, selected by Oatley also suggests something that the humanities can add to this conversation, something that's very different from what scientists are looking for when they look at FID, something that is in fact so different that it flips the scientific hypothesis on its head. As Oatley notes, FID was popularized by Austen, but it did in fact have a history before her. In English literature, we can find it as far back as Chaucer, and in particular, Chaucer's account of the monk. Now, Chaucer takes a very wry view of the monk. I don't know if you've ever met a monk in your real life, but in theory, monks are supposed to spend their time in cloisters, doing secluded monkly activities. This is not what Chaucer's monk does. Chaucer's monk, as you can perhaps gain from the pictures, spends an enormous amount of his time reveling, drinking, and riding about on horseback with his hunting dogs, which, as you can tell from this lovely illuminated manuscript, are incredibly ferocious, and all the local foxes in northern Britain were terribly afraid of them. So Chaucer doesn't use free and direct discourse to make us identify with the monk. He uses it to satirize the monk. The monk isn't acting like a monk should act. And so he's using free and direct discourse to encourage us to judge the monk, to push the monk out of our sympathies. Moreover, Chaucer isn't unique in using free and direct discourse this way. The earliest example that we know of free and direct discourse in any language occurs in Latin in Horace. And in particular, it occurs in Horace's satires. And as this sculpture indicates, Horace, I was going to quote the actual Latin for you, but then I thought I might get confused since it's not my native language, as you might have told. So instead, I'm giving you this delightful sculpture, which is a kind of visual imitation as produced by the ancient Romans themselves of what's going on in Horace. Horace uses free and direct discourse to create a sense of estrangement, a sense of the aberrant, of the peculiar. He allows you to look into people's minds so that you judge their minds and say, that's not the appropriate way that you should be thinking. That's not what you should be doing. So once again, this is the opposite of empathy. Well, do we have any indication whatsoever that Austen herself might have thought about free and direct discourse this same way? Let's go back to this passage from Pride and Prejudice and ask ourselves whether there's any sign that Austen, like Chaucer and Horace, might have wanted us to laugh at Mrs. Bennet. Is there anything potentially ridiculous about Mrs. Bennet? Is there anything at all that we might consider laughable about Mrs. Bennet? The answer to this question is yes, in case you were wondering. The answer is yes. Mrs. Bennet is a figure of comic fun. Mrs. Bennet is somebody who reads too many romance novels and as a result is seized constantly by enthusiasms that all around her wedding bells are happening, when in fact they are not actually happening, or at least not happening yet, because we have to wait to the end of the novel for actual wedding bells to occur. And when we turn to the specific example of free and direct discourse cited by Oli, we can see, in fact, that Austen is not just satirizing Mrs. Bennet in this example, but she's specifically satirizing her for her efforts to read someone else's mind. So here's the full passage from Pride and Prejudice. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favorable. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and to crown the whole, he was to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. So by the time we get to the end of this passage, we can see this ironic tone creeping in. Mrs. Bennet thinks there's something tremendously delightful about this young man who's coming to the party, but her enthusiasm isn't based on reliable evidence. It's based on second-hand information, which is to say, it's based on gossip. And this gossip leads Mrs. Bennet to misconstrue a young man's love of dancing and parties as a sign of his matrimonial seriousness. Because in fact, not all young men who go to parties are actually interested in getting married. And Austen highlights Mrs. Bennet's error by showing us that indeed this particular dancing young man does not want to get hitched at all. He's very immature. He's subsequently, right after this party, going to break everyone's heart. And Mrs. Bennet is only hearing wedding bells because she's read too many romance novels. Novels being dangerous in Austen's view because they make you over-sentimental and they cause you to empathize and fall in love too easily. And so when the text enthuses nothing could be more delightful, it's mocking Mrs. Bennet, and in particular, it's mocking her for thinking that she can read the young man's mind. She thinks, I know exactly what he's thinking. He wants to get married, but he doesn't want to think that at all. And so what Austen is saying here is, you can't read other people's minds as quickly as you think you can. Maybe you should slow down, because by leaping to assumptions, you're creating trouble for yourself and the ones that you love. And to confirm that this is not an unorthodox use of free and direct discourse by Austen, we can return to the first example I quoted from the beginning of Austen's first novel. And And you can see here, again, as with Mrs. Bennet, the narrator is mocking Mrs. John Dashwood, because Mrs. John Dashwood is so concerned about her dear little boy that she's not being empathetic. She's not caring about other people. So in this moment where she thinks she's displaying this concern for her child, she's in fact being deeply self-absorbed. And so once again, we have a failure to understand what other people are thinking, a failure to understand how other people are experiencing the world. Now, let's shift our method of inquiry from one humanities mode to another. I've been doing a kind of cultural history here and kind of going back. Let's shift it a little bit to literary formalism. And what we can see is that this distancing effect of free and direct discourse is reflected in the form of the narrative itself. Because when you look at the quote from Sense and Sensibility, you see that the narrative doesn't just pivot into the italicized first person, it also pivots out, back into the non-italicized third person. So it goes into the first person, but it also goes out. And this going out points us to a very different theory of free and direct discourse, which was articulated a couple of years before Austin by Adam Smith. Adam Smith, fairly big influence on Austin's theory of ethics, and Adam Smith himself was very influenced by the enlightened philosopher David Hume, who is a radical skeptic about our ability to know other minds. Hume said, you know, as much as we might want to think we can never get into someone else's heads, actually, if you notice, your nervous system does not connect to their brains. Therefore, everything you're doing is based on speculation and hypothesis. It's not necessarily the case. And so even though Smith was very invested in the possibility of sympathy, he was also aware that it wasn't totally possible. And in fact, he believed that one of the prime causes of antisocial behavior was our tendency to over-empathize with people, to write our feelings over them. If you've ever had that kind of moment where you're kind of expressing something that's happening to you and somebody says, oh yes, I know exactly how you feel. And of course they don't, because how could anyone know exactly how you feel, right? So Smith is basically saying this is a problem because we think we're being caring, but instead we're being self-absorbed. And this leads Smith to propose a different mechanism for free and direct discourse. What's important for Smith is the pivot out of the first into the third, because he says that this pivot shows us we don't have access to other minds. We go briefly into their minds, and then the narrative rips us out again. And that ripping out is the narrative saying, you think you know, but really you don't know. So the narrative over and over and over again is putting us in and then pulling us out. And it's that pulling out, according to Smith, that's important. Because what it reminds us of is the fact that we are distant from other people. And so what it ultimately emphasizes is our outsideness from other minds. So we've seen that this sense of outsideness originates historically in satire. So we're outside other minds to judge them. But what Smith says is, over time, this outsideness from other people doesn't necessarily have to be judgmental. It can be neutral. We can be outside other minds and not judge them as good or bad. Just recognize that we're outside the minds of those people. The form of free and direct discourse, he suggests, is neutral. And this is, in fact, something that's reflected in the evolution of Austin's own writing. By the time you get to Emma, Emma's essentially a narrative of a young woman who thinks she knows what's best for all of her friends, and so she's constantly setting them up on dates all the time. And it turns out that, in fact, her friends don't love the people that Emma knows that they should love, and so she spends the entire novel trying to force them to love the people that she knows that they should love. And the end of the novel is essentially Emma realizing, I was wrong to think I understood. And beyond that, I was wrong to think that there was something wrong with their romantic choices. My judgment, my looking down on them was incorrect. And so the end of Emma uses free and direct discourse to create that separation, but not make us judge people because they make different romantic choices from us, but to say their difference is important. The fact that they're different from us, that's their individuality. That's what makes them special. That's not something worthy of contempt. That's something that's worthy of accepting and even celebrating. And so this is this evolution that Austin's own prose style goes through. And so here, for clarity, you see the difference between these two different ways of thinking about free and direct discourse and its effect. On the kind of more mind-reading model, it's that pivot in that matters. On this self-restraint model, it's the pivot out that matters. What I want to emphasize is that I don't think either of these is right, or either of these precludes the other from happening. In fact, I think it's almost certainly the case that both of them are correct. And it really depends on how the free and direct discourse is being used by the writer. So for example, if you have a writer who emphasizes that pivot in and then allows you to remain for long stretches of time within that first-person perspective, it probably develops feelings of empathy. If you have a writer like Austen who goes in frequently for very short periods of time, by the time you get to Emma, she's often going in for less than a sentence. You're like flickering in and flickering out. That kind of effect has more of a kind of distancing effect. So I think both of these can be correct, but what's interesting to me is that scientists have tested for one of them. And we would also like to test for the other one. And so that's what I did with the help of John Monterosso, who's a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California. We tested for this other effect, and we saw if we gave people passage of free and direct discourse that instead emphasized this third-person pivot. And the way we did this, I'm not going to bore you with all the details of our experimental design. It's going to be published in Narrative, and you guys can read the full extent of it yourselves. But basically what we did is we tried to create a flutter effect, where we went in very briefly and then pulled back out over and over and over again to emphasize this third-person pivot. And what we found is that there was no first-person identification, so it didn't create a feeling of empathy. It instead created this sense of third-person identification outside the character with the narrative. But it also produced an increased sense of tolerance. Our respondents said things like, well, I don't understand why they did the things they did, but I don't think it's necessarily bad that they did the things that they did. And so the participants who had this kind of a passage as opposed to a passage that didn't have the free and direct discourse became more tolerant, just like Austen and just like Smith would have predicted. The study, moreover, is the basis for a series of ongoing projects we're doing at Project Narrative. We're doing an imaging study. You can see some data from John Monterosso's lab here about what the kind of flip from a first-person to a third-person perspective might look like. We're also doing a study, for example, with a medical school. There's very high rates of burnouts, depersonalization, all sorts of things that go on among doctors as they go through their training. And this depersonalization, it has been shown, leads to lowered levels of patient care, because essentially if you stop treating your patient like a human being and you treat them as a kind of bag of symptoms, it leads you not to pick up on all sorts of social cues about what they're actually saying when they're in your office. Because a lot of times when patients come into your office, they don't immediately come out and articulate the thing that's most important. And sometimes you have to have those skills, those narrative skills, and those ability to treat a human being like a human being. And so we're looking at the effects of taking elective literature courses on medical students, whether or not it reduces levels of burnout, these kinds of things. But I'm going to stop talking now about my own specific research. And I want to talk about the kind of more general ramifications of this approach. Because what I've been trying to suggest to you is that humanities scholars can bring something important to experimental design. That there's something important that humanities scholars have because of their deep knowledge of how these texts seem like they might work, both in terms of the history and the form and all these other things that humanities scholars learn. And that if we simply leave experiments to literature, to scientists, we're never going to get more than half the picture. It's going to be a very interesting, exciting half of the picture, but we're never going to get more than half of the picture. And so this is really a call to humanists to start running these experiments, to go out, to start participating in experiment design, to use your knowledge to help fill in that other part of the equation, to think about what are the things, perhaps the less intuitive parts of literature or history or philosophy that might be missed by someone who hasn't had to suffer through 5 or 7 or 12 or 15 years getting their PhD, or whatever it now takes in the humanities to be considered qualified enough to teach 18-year-olds. So from a humanities perspective, this would seem like a good thing. What I'm basically arguing for is this idea that no matter how important science becomes, no matter how crucial experiments become, there's always going to be a deep and profound role for humanists in this kind of study. So this would seem like a good thing. But there are a lot of humanists who are not going to be entirely comforted by my vision of a brave new future. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But I'm going to highlight one of the reasons that's probably the most obvious. And one of the most obvious is that scientific explanations of human behavior tend to be mechanistic, or to put it more bluntly, deterministic. And most humanists, past and present, have tended to resist determinism. And this is one of the reasons that humanists in particular don't like science. Even if they don't always admit it, humanists always feel like scientists are arriving and kind of bullying them and telling them what's right. And they feel like essentially scientists are determining the meaning of things. And humanists always want to push back against that and say, well, it's more complicated, or there's more room for choice. Because humanists want to preserve creative and political autonomy. Because to a humanist, what makes us human? If we're not capable of making choices, if we're not capable of generating things that are not determined by mass and motion, what makes us human? So humanists are going to resist science in general because of this kind of deterministic approach. And as you will note, my experiment not only has not escaped this charge of determinism, but really has reinforced it. I've offered you a different model of what might be going on, but what I've also suggested, no less than the kind of mind-reading model of free and direct discourse, that when we sit down and read Austen's novels, we have our brains and our behaviors changed without us consciously realizing it. You open the book, and without choosing to be changed, you are changed. And this, of course, seems kind of Orwellian. This seems kind of 1984. But over the rest of this talk, I'm going to attempt to convince you that this is, in fact, a good thing, that this model of literature is, in fact, a good thing. So I'm not going to back away from this consequence. I'm going to double down, and I'm going to see where it takes us. Because, hey, I'm a humanist, right? And nothing that I do has any consequences anyway. And the way I'm going to go about this is I'm going to suggest that the historical origins of democracy lie in part in using literature to unconsciously reshape people's behavior, to make them more tolerant, to make them more curious, to make them more inclusive, without them consciously realizing it. And this seems very strange to us because we now live in a moment of history where this isn't how we think about democracy at all. We think about the primary source of democracy as being freedom. And this is because we've been influenced by various liberal philosophies, using liberal here not in the sense of liberal versus conservative, but liberal in the sense of John Locke and people like that. Liberal philosophies that have encouraged us to believe that autonomy is the foundation of democracy, and have encouraged us to imagine that various philosophical ideals such as justice and equality and reason, these are the basis of democracy. This is a very powerful approach to democracy, and I certainly don't want to get rid of it. But I do want to point out that for all its strengths, it also has weaknesses. And it's been critiqued quite aggressively for theoretical reasons by a lot of radical Democrats who are influenced by feminism and Foucault and a lot of other F words. It's also been critiqued for practical reasons. And the practical reason is it hasn't worked. And the most spectacular example of it not working recently is Iraq. But things have gotten so bad for democracy over the last 10 years that if you talk to a political scientist, they will start talking to you about things such as the democracy rollback and the democracy recession. And what they're talking about is that there has been a rise in autocracy in the Middle East, in the Third World, and in the West itself. Democracy is not, as people thought, as Fukuyama famously prophesied, democracy has not established itself as the inevitable end of history. It's in fact going backwards. What I'm going to suggest to you is that this is not the end of democracy. Don't freak out. It's going to be okay. Because there are other ways of encouraging democracy, and I'm going to pitch one to you right now that comes to us from the ancient world. And this is covered in more detail in this book I have coming out with Hopkins this spring. So if you're intrigued or interested by this, you can get more detail than I'll be able to give you tonight. But what I talk about in the book is that the Greeks had a very different understanding of democracy, one that went on to influence the Roman Republic and then went on to become one of the foundations of the American Revolution. And this approach to democracy is not based in a philosophical ideal of freedom. It's based in a pragmatic emphasis on diversity. And on this model, the more that a country nurtures diversity, protecting minorities, and incorporating them into government, the more tools it will have to solve the daily challenges of existence. Because surprise, surprise, white dudes don't have all the answers. So diversity, in other words, can be more than just the sign of a just and equal society. Diversity can be a source of human survival. If we want to put it in Darwinian terms, diversity can be adaptive. Now, because diversity is the bedrock of this understanding of democracy, the ancients and their American kind of followers were willing to cultivate it through bodily means, which is to say they were willing to cultivate it through ritual, through performance, and through literature. So that they were encouraging it not by engaging people's conscious reason. This is the Enlightenment model of democracy, post-Locke, post-Kant, where people have to think really hard about philosophical concepts, develop a sense of autonomy. Instead, this older model is, no, you can go to a play. You can go to a play, and the result of going to this play will cause you to act with more curiosity, more self-restraint, more tolerance. And this behavioral approach leads, interestingly, to a central role in democracy for comedy. And this has been one of these things that has really baffled scholars for a very, very long time. One of the first things we know about comedy is that it was invented by democracy. This is the only thing, if you've ever read Aristotle's Poetics, which is a very long and weird book in which Aristotle attempts to explain all of literature. And he talks for a great deal of time about tragedy, but there's only one sentence in there about comedy, and that is, the Megarians claim to have invented comedy in the days of their democracy. And that's apparently all that Aristotle feels is necessary to say about comedy. So there's this long historical relationship between comedy and democracy. Why? Well, because comedy historically is one of the most bodily forms of ancient literature. It engages its audience through sex, through song, through other forms of fleshly entertainment. It really taps into those physical aspects of our existence. And I have about maybe 24 examples of this, not tonight, but in the book. But I want to just give you one to give you a sense of how interesting and complex it can be. And I'm going to focus on one of the more surprising behaviors that our ancestors associated with democracy, which is risk-taking. Risk-taking. Now, why would risk-taking be democratic? Well, to keep it simple, the rich and powerful have more to lose by taking risks, and the poor and disempowered have more to gain. That's why the powerful are often conservative. They're doing okay in the status quo, and they don't really want to rock the boat that much. But the disempowered tend to benefit from risk-taking because obviously they have less to lose. They're already closer to the bottom floor, and they have a lot more to gain. And this feature of risk-taking is widely explored and promoted in ancient comedy through the character of the clever slave. And what the clever slave does is lure his masters into taking chances, wild chances. And as a result of taking these chances, the masters lose their power, or some of their power, and the slave therefore gains power because the master becomes dependent on the slave to help get him out of these circumstances that he's created for himself by reaching too far. And there was a line that the comic poets used to sum up this ploy that the slaves had. And this was articulated by the Roman playwright Terence, who was himself, very interestingly, a slave. And he coins the expression, fortune favors the bold. And here you see one of the comic slaves literally working this line on his masters, trying to convince them, hey, be bold, good things will happen, you'll get even richer. I know you're rich now, but rich people always want more money, don't they? So this phrase subsequently becomes very important and very popular during the Roman Republic. And 1,500 years later, it's cited by Machiavelli as one of the reasons that democracy emerges in Rome. Machiavelli has a long, elegant explanation for this, but the basic narrative goes something like this. The Roman kings were encouraged by this idea of fortune favoring the bold to undertake a series of risky wars. As a result of taking these risky wars, they felt they had to empower their subjects more and more to fight in these wars. They had to arm more and more of the poor to fight in these wars. And then what happened when the Roman kings won the war? The poor didn't want to give up their weapons. And they knocked over the kings, and they established the Roman Republic. This is the kind of basic narrative that Machiavelli gives us. So Machiavelli claims that risk-taking helped birth democracy, and he liked Terence's comic phrase so much that he wrote his own comedy, which hinges on a moment in which a servant baits his masters into taking a risk. And here you see the specific language that the servant uses, this specific Machiavellian bait. From a distance, many things seem difficult and strange, that when you approach them, become tolerable and familiar. So Machiavelli isn't really known today as a playwright, but his play was very important in the Renaissance. It circulated in the American colonies. John Adams claimed it as the greatest work of the Italian Renaissance. John Adams was asked at some point, what do you think is the most important work of the Italian Renaissance? And this is what he pops out with. And so it was that in 1776, when Thomas Paine came to write Common Sense, he incorporates many of Machiavelli's comic tricks into Common Sense, ending with the final line of his treatise, which is pretty much a rip of this line. So you can compare on the slide just how similar Paine's language is to Machiavelli's. It's basically almost identical. And the effects of this comic appeal were revolutionary. George Washington claimed that Common Sense, quote, worked a powerful change in the minds of the delegates at the Second Continental Congress, and that it was this which essentially lured them into voting for this risky war of independence. So we can't, unfortunately, go back in a time machine and brain scan all the members of the Second Continental Congress. But we have George Washington's word that their minds were changed. And as you know, George Washington never tells a lie. So I, myself, am convinced that it's true. And what's interesting is that the same dynamic that Machiavelli claimed happened in Rome, whether or not it did actually happen in Rome, actually plays out in the American Revolution. So essentially what happens is the Founding Fathers rush into declaring this war with England, with Britain, and then all of a sudden they discover, oh my goodness, in order to win this war, we have to empower more and more and more of our social inferiors. And to fill the ranks of the American army, they had to grant citizenship to all these people who they had not originally imagined being citizens. They granted citizenship to Native Americans. They granted citizenship to white servants. They granted citizenship to free blacks and to mulattoes. And so it was that the Founding Fathers, who had essentially imagined America as being a kind of quasi-oligarchy in which the rich made pretty much all the decisions, in which property really was the deciding factor in whether or not you qualified as a free citizen, found it necessary to kind of rip all this stuff out and embrace a much more radical version of democracy. Now, this democracy wasn't perfect. There were a lot of groups that weren't included in it. It didn't include slaves. It didn't include women, who you may have heard constitute half of the population. But it was a pragmatic step towards democracy. And in the book, I go on to suggest how comedy helped democracy take more steps. So to give you a couple of examples, I suggest that the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, comes from comedy. And not only does it come from comedy, but it has a fairly traceable comic effect. I look at a lot of Frederick Douglass's notoriously funny speeches for abolition. We don't tend to think of Frederick Douglass as a very, very funny guy, but the guy was tremendously funny. It's something commented over and over and over and over again by people who went to go see his talks. They were like, oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting to laugh so hard. And so there's all these ways in which these ancient comic techniques come back and are used in the building of American democracy. But the larger point I'm trying to make here isn't any of these details. It's that the physical history of both ancient Greece and the early American Republic show us how democracy can be promoted through these bodily, non-conscious, non-voluntary means, which is to say, exactly the same way that free and direct discourse works in Austin, making our behavior more tolerant without requiring our minds to make any conscious choice. And this is the part of my talk where I'm really going to test your patience, because I'm going to suggest that this can help us rethink what we do in the humanities and can open up a kind of rhetorical passage that we're not currently using, which is to say it can allow us to engage more with Hollywood. And because if we think that literature can function in a physiological way, making us more democratic in the same way that a vaccine or a cancer drug can make you healthier, operating on your body without your mind having to consciously think about it, then the humanities does not need to confine itself to the modes of communication that it currently uses, which is to say articles, monographs, New York Times editorials, seminars, all these devices which are designed to make people think more critically. Instead, in the same way that scientists have partnered with the pharmaceutical industry to engineer new vaccines and cancer drugs, humanists can partner with the entertainment industry, and we can use our expertise to reprogram soap operas, reprogram superhero movies, and reprogram all these modes of popular fun so that we use them to promote curiosity, tolerance, risk-taking, the rest of these democratic behaviors that we value in the humanities. Now, this mechanistic approach to literature may or may not disturb some of you. I'm trying to keep it less disturbing by suggesting that we can rewrite Hollywood movies as opposed to novels or poetry or other things like that, although I suspect the same thing would also work in those media. But the reason I'm most attracted to Hollywood is because Hollywood is really the area where most people are popularly reached. And if you could go and just make a little change, a little influence in TV, in film, you could possibly have a very profound effect on a large segment of the American public that doesn't necessarily think of themselves as being engaged in a humanist education. So I've already cited Machiavelli once, and as you will notice, this is a fairly Machiavellian approach to promoting democracy, getting into people's living rooms and changing their brains. So to this extent, I've worked with a fair number of Hollywood producers. I've worked with Bob Shea and Michael Lynn, who are the producers of Lord of the Rings. I've worked with the Philip Dick Estate. I've worked with Churn Entertainment, who does Planet of the Apes. I've done some TV shows. And I'm going to talk to you very briefly tonight about a new TV show that I'm doing that employs some of these democratic methods that I'm employing. And I can't go into like insane amounts of detail about this because technically it's not even mine anymore. You have to sell these things to people and then they take them from you. But I will tell you as much as I can about the show and hopefully whet your interest enough that you'll watch it. So the show is being financed by Prescience, which is the company that won an Oscar for doing The King's Speech. And it's being produced by Anonymous Content that has developed its own reputation for risk-taking in shows like this and like this. And this is our show. This is the idea for our show. And what we're basically going to do in this show is we're going to retell the Trojan War from the perspective of the woman who started it, but who is almost completely missing from Homer's Iliad. And in particular, we're going to suggest that Helen embodies a series of virtues that we now embrace within the humanities: persuasion, tact, subtlety, introspection. In the ancient world, people didn't really like these virtues that much. Or I should be more specific and say men didn't really like these virtues that much. And they tried to suppress them very aggressively with the logic of war and power because they found these virtues to be strange and effete. So part of what will be democratic about the show is we'll be recovering this lost character from history, and we're going to be making her virtues part of the story again. But it's not just going to be the content of the show that I hope is democratic. It will also hopefully be the form of the show, because we're going to take some of these formal techniques and tricks like the ones I've been talking about and use them and apply them to our presentation of Helen. And to help us do this will be Karen Paik, who's an executive at Pixar and who's agreed to hop on board as our story engineer. So here is the first scene of the pilot, which hopefully you won't be able to read too much of, so I won't get fired. And this pilot episode is going to begin with Helen seducing a male warrior. So she's going to use all of her tricks, all of her humanities tricks, her seduction, her persuasion, her subtlety, to convince this warrior that she's exactly what he thinks he is, that she's exactly his feminine ideal. And then what are we going to do? Just like in free and direct discourse, we'll break that first-person closeness by revealing what she has behind her back, which is an axe. And the man who thought he could read Helen's mind will suddenly discover that there's, in fact, more going on between her ears than he thought. And once we've played this trick on the characters in the world, we'll pull similar tricks on the audience themselves. So, for example, we'll make our audience feel sympathy for Helen by portraying her as a kind of archetype of the helpless damsel in distress, snatched away by a powerful man, until Helen rescues herself, naked, on horseback, with a spear. So this reversal is going to show the audience Helen has undiscovered countries inside her. And we're not just going to restrict this approach to how we introduce Helen. We're going to try and use it to shape our entire retelling of the Trojan War. So we're going to present the audience with the heroes they know, Achilles, the archetypal Greek, and then we're going to show them the not-so-archetypal Greek. So on a very basic level, what we're going to do is we're going to use Helen and her world to challenge expectations, encouraging the audience to be more curious, to rush less quickly into empathy, to realize that other minds are different in interesting ways from our own, so that in its own modest way, the show is going to attempt to encourage a behavioral source of democracy. So please, if you have any particularly fascist friends, encourage them to tune in. So what I've tried to do over this talk is outline a fairly ambitious program for how the humanities might join with an experimental method. I've suggested that humanists can help to design new experiments, that we can help to promote physical democracy, that we can help to reprogram Hollywood. And I don't believe that this is the only way that humanists can contribute to a scientific present. There's many different contributions as there are humanists to make them, and you've seen many different visions which are tremendously powerful over the course of this conference. But I've tried to present you with a particularly ambitious vision of what the humanities can do, because we live in a moment in which the humanities are being marginalized. And I think it's important to remember that the humanities can do big things. Humanities can do bold things. If Helen of Troy shows us anything, it's that subtlety, persuasion, the things that we do can turn the world upside down. And not all of us can be Helen of Troy, but Jane Austen reminds us we don't need to be. She got up every morning in obscurity to write out stories with a pen because she put her faith in the quiet power of literature. And by doing so, she changed everything. That's my talk. Thank you, guys. So yeah, great. Oh, great.
I'll take the microphone around to questioners.
Yeah, if you guys have any questions or you want to know anything, I'm more than happy if I haven't given you enough eccentricity.
So I sort of had a flashback in the last part of your talk to Norman Lear.
Yeah.
And All in the Family, the character of Archie Bunker.
Yeah.
And comic democracy.
Yeah.
I mean, I only know Norman Lear through his work.
Yeah.
But here's somebody who seems to me who throughout the 60s and
Yeah.